I'd like to welcome Minister Rabbit to the House. We're on item number 47, motion 8, regarding public debate on issues of free speech. Senator Zappone.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. And sorry?
10 minutes.
Thank you very much. And welcome to the Chamber, Minister, and thank you so much for agreeing to take the motion. Your statements on the issue have been very helpful to date, Minister, and our debate today, I think, indicates that much more needs to be said and done so that, in the first place, homophobia someday will be wiped out of Irish culture and society. And I know there's been a lot of debate on how we define homophobia. I have here the European Parliament's definition of homophobia, and I say, why wouldn't we accept the European Parliament's definition of homophobia, which is a wide continuum? Colin O'Gorman, I think, first pointed it out to us recently. Homophobia defined as an irrational fear of and aversion to homosexuality, manifesting itself in different forms, such as hate speech, all the way from hate speech to discrimination and violation of the principle of equality and unjustified and unreasonable limitations of rights. Why wouldn't we have that wide understanding and definition of homophobia? So I think more needs to be said and done in order to wipe that out of Irish culture and society. But in second place, and that's maybe perhaps what we're here for today, that I think political leadership can ensure that debate on marriage equality is conducted in a fair, open, and impartial manner. Impartial means without prejudice, and that raises the bar very high. I think Rory O'Neill has done a great service to our country and to wider global LGBT and other human rights movements when exercising his absolute and unrestricted right to hold opinions without interference. This is a right guaranteed under the Civil and Political Rights Covenant, International Covenant, and Ireland has obliged itself to uphold this. And when he further exercised his human right to freedom of expression, that's also in the Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, both on the Saturday night show and on the stage of the Abbey Theatre, his fundamental call, his fundamental noble call to all of us, is to eradicate our prejudices and to change oppressive social, legal, religious, and cultural systems. Minister, silencing voices against homophobia violates human rights, as Barrister Brian Barrington pointed out. Why is this the case? Well, I think it really boils down to two words: human dignity. And no doubt, all sides of this House agree with the first lines of the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that recognition of the inherent dignity and of equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in our world. The genuine experience of dignity is a quintessential ingredient for the empowerment of every human to lead the life they wish to choose. And I paraphrase here words of the great philosopher and economist Amartya Sen in his pioneering work, Development as Freedom. Professor Sen uses this concept of all humans living the life they wish to choose as not only integral to eradicating world poverty, but also as being core to the rights of all minorities. A nation's development does not happen unless all of its people are free. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Whenever men and women straighten their backs up, they are going somewhere, because a man can't ride your back unless it is bent." As a young lesbian, I did not always carry a genuine experience of human dignity. Indeed, I often felt shame. Shame for my feelings, shame for my actions, and shame for who I was discovering myself to be. And I wonder now, is that a similar feeling of shame to those in this country who are out of work, to those who left school early, to those in prison, to those who beg on our streets, or to our young lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people? But what I do know is that shame does bend your back. And what I do know is that shame is never generated from within. It develops as others who are not like you or others who possess more resources or abilities than you suspect that your difference is deviant. And I think it develops also when you run up against laws and systems fashioned by religious and state leaders that keep you outside the mainstream of social, cultural, and economic opportunities or institutions or human worth or human worthiness. Martha Nussbaum, one of the foremost philosopher lawyers of our time, calls it the politics of disgust. Minister, international human rights standards value free speech over being spoken of offensively. International human rights law sets a high bar before speech can be considered to be of such a degree of offensiveness that the state must prohibit it. And the more serious the issue in public debate, the higher is the bar. The UN Human Rights Committee says that, and I'm going to quote them here, the mere fact that forms of expression are considered insulting to a public figure is not sufficient to justify the imposition of penalties. And when it's reflecting on and interpreting another part of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that says we need also to respect the reputation of others, that must be taken into account, it says, and I quote them again, the UN Human Rights Committee, it says that it may never be invoked, that respecting the reputation of others, it may never be invoked as justification for the muzzling of any advocacy of human rights. I feel a chill, as many others do, and so we need a thaw. I welcome the steps that you, as Minister for Communications, have outlined today. I look forward to what you have to say to us this afternoon, Minister. I guess I'm going to urge you, I'm going to identify some things I think that you and the government could enact, additional measures, so that our republic genuinely values freedom and tolerance. In my view, we need, and this is not an exhaustive list, and nor is it sequential, I think we need RTE to appear before the Communications Committee to outline its approach to libel complaints, and that RTE subsequently issues and disseminates guidelines regarding freedom of expression and defamation. These guidelines should be given to all who go on our national airwaves. I think this would be a prime way for the state broadcaster to fulfill its public service role. And I also think that the process of devising such guidelines would no doubt go a long way towards assessing whether or not our laws can adequately protect the human right to free speech. It would be extremely, extremely useful, I think, also to have our politicians in exchange with RTE on what are needed in such guidelines. And I do agree, Minister, with your dull statement, though, that it is not desirable for the committee to become embroiled in the management of particular claims. Secondly, I think that we also need a freedom of expression audit of both the Broadcasting Act and the Defamation Act. I do welcome the fact that you will consider making amendments to the Broadcasting Act. I think that's very constructive. Along with other commentators, I'm not certain that amending Section 39 of the Broadcasting Act, as you have noted, from something broadcast that may be reasonably regarded as causing offense to something that avoids causing undue offense, I'm not sure that will make much difference. The degree of harm, which undue I think refers to, is already part of the test of reasonableness in the Act in a later section. Freedom of expression is the norm, and any restriction on it must be the exception. I know also that it is not, while it is not under your remit, I do think that the Defamation Act could be reviewed as well. For example, the Defamation Act, while it includes a defense of honest opinion for the one accused, this defense may require too strong a factual threshold for opinions as it is currently in the law. I think the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, though they're not fully established, and this is a problem too, I think though they would be best placed to do this work. And indeed, it seems to me that if we had a designated Human Rights Committee, this would be the best parliamentary place to receive such work. Anyhow, thirdly, and as I said, it's not exhaustive, but I think we also need policies, laws, and resources to ensure that our schools are homophobia-free zones. Minister Quinn is committed to this, I know, and I, for one, stand up against homophobic bullying, a hugely important campaign being run by, belonged to, supported by other groups, marriage equality, tanning, transparency, coming to the end. But in my view, much more needs to be done in getting rid of Section 37.1 from our Employment Equality Act, would be a massive catalyst to usher in a new era of freedom in our schools. To conclude, I stand here as a married woman, married to another woman, Anne Louise Gilligan. I have traveled beyond the valley of shame and fear because her forever love beckoned. That's what marriage equality means. And that's why I think we must get this right. And it is in our power to do so.
Senator Bacik.
And I'd like to second the motion. In fact, I'm honoured to stand here to second the motion to follow Senator Zappone's very powerful speech proposing this motion. I'd like to welcome Minister Rabbitte to the House, and delighted as Minister for Communications that you're here, Minister, to respond to our speeches on the motion. And I'd also like to welcome in the public gallery members of Glen, of Marriage Equality and others, and in particular to acknowledge Anne Louise Gilligan here tonight, Senator Zappone's partner and indeed wife, I should say. I want to second this motion, which covers a number of different issues, and just to commend Senator Zappone for framing it so carefully, because the motion recognises the importance of having a public debate on the issues of free speech, homophobia and the public service role of the state broadcaster, and to explore the issues in the context of the forthcoming referendum on marriage equality. It's a motion which of course has strong cross-party support based on recent events and arising out of the recent events that Senator Zappone has spoken of. Indeed, a number of us have already been active on this issue, and Senator Power, in fact, raised the recent events concerning Rory O'Neill and his both his speech on the Abbey stage and the earlier interview on the Brendan O'Connor show. Senator Power, I think, was the first to raise these in the Leinster House, and both Senator Power and I attended the LGBT Noise event some weeks ago in support of Rory O'Neill, at which Senator Norris spoke so powerfully. So there's been a good deal of context before we come to tonight in this motion. As everyone is aware, Rory O'Neill appeared on the Brendan O'Connor show on Saturday the 11th of January, and subsequent to that appearance and subsequent to remarks he'd made about, and I have the transcript of the remarks, about people being horrible and mean about gays, and describing his own direct experience with people. Following those remarks, RTE then made a settlement with the Iona Institute and other individuals, the speed and scale of which I think shocked people, and I think this is one of these events that's had a slow momentum. I think what surprised people and what created the response that occurred was that it appeared that legal advice to RTE had trumped the editorial judgment of the broadcaster, and indeed had trumped any consideration of its obligations as a public service broadcaster under the Broadcasting Act, in particular Section 25. It also seemed as if there had been inadequate consideration of running a defence of honest opinion, to which Senator Zappone has referred in Section 20 of the Act, of the Defamation Act. And indeed, whether or not one agreed with Rory O'Neill's use of the term homophobia, he was clearly entitled to express his own experience of homophobia and to describe his own experience. And in doing so, and in going on then to describe so eloquently in his speech on the Abbey stage on the 1st of February his experience of homophobia and of discrimination, I think he has done the state a great service in naming this experience of prejudice. Now, as Senator Zappone has said, the definition of homophobia has changed. It certainly isn't confined to the Oxford Dictionary definition. There are other dictionaries like the Merriam Dictionary which define it in much broader terms as discrimination against persons on the basis of their sexuality. The EU definition has also broadened out our understanding of the term homophobia to encompass a range of negative attitudes and discriminations towards gay people. And indeed, Barrister Brian Barrington has made that point very powerfully. And the naming of experience of discrimination and prejudice was done very powerfully also in the Dáil speeches that followed the outcry around the payout by RTE. The Dáil speeches by our colleagues, Deputies John Lyons and Jerry Buttimer in particular, naming their experience of prejudice. We know also through the work that Minister Quinn has been doing on taking steps to tackle homophobic bullying in schools, that this remains a real problem, a real issue, and a really terrible experience for many young people still in our schools, and Belong To and other groups have highlighted that. So I think, there's been a sequence of events that have transpired since the 11th of January. And I think the positive consequence of these has been that we are much more aware in Irish society generally, I think, of the experience of LGBT individuals, the experience of discrimination, of prejudice, and of homophobia. The experience, as Panty described it on the stage of the Abbey Theatre, of checking yourself in public spaces. The experience that's been described in surveys that have been conducted, where individuals who are in same-sex relationships feel fearful of holding hands in public because of the discrimination or prejudice they may encounter. So I think it's positive that these experiences are highlighted and that we are more aware in Irish society of discrimination and prejudice. I think what would be a negative consequence would be if people feel they can close down debates around marriage equality by lawyering up, especially where people have used robust terms like feminazis in debates before. And certainly that's a term I don't like, it's been used against me, but I would certainly not sue anyone over its use. As the motion says, it's very important the debate on marriage equality is conducted in a fair, open and impartial manner. I don't believe for a minute, I don't think anyone does, that everyone who opposes marriage... Thank you, Chair. That everyone who opposes marriage equality is homophobic. But certainly those who campaign against it, who actively seek to continue discrimination against gay people and seek to prevent equal recognition of their relationships, I think that amounts to homophobia. I think what needs to be done in order to ensure that the debate is conducted in a fair, open and impartial manner, I think there are a number of things we can do. First, it is important that RTE would appear before the Communications Committee. I understand they're doing so. Senator Zappone has spoken of guidelines, and I think she's right that to welcome your proposal, Minister, to amend Section 39(1)(d) of the Broadcasting Act, to strengthen that, to ensure that simply causing offence is not enough, that it must be undue offence of some kind. I think we need to look at the language there. The amendment to the Defamation Act, I think it would be useful to review that. I'm not sure whether the Act itself was the problem or interpretation of the Act in this particular instance. And finally, we do need to bring forward the legislation amending Section 37 of the Employment Equality Act to try and counter that real fear of prejudice and discrimination that gay teachers in particular continue to experience on a daily basis. We've tried to do that in the Seanad. We've introduced legislation here. Again, Senator Power and myself, there is a bill which has passed second stage this time last year, and I'm actively working with Ministers Quinn and Shatter to ensure that we can move that bill forward so that we can see legislation in place that will amend Section 37. And very finally, we had a debate last night in my local, Dublin South East or Dublin Bay South Labour Party with Brian Sheehan from Glen, where we spoke about the real experience of homophobia that young people in particular suffer every day at school, and that must be a key priority for any government strategy on tackling homophobia. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. Minister, I welcome you to the House for this important debate. As Senator Bacik has said, last month in the aftermath of the revelations regarding RTE settlement with John Waters and Breda O'Brien and members of the Iona Institute, I called for the Minister to come before the House to discuss this issue, and I did so for a number of reasons. Firstly, I was horrified by the way that Rory O'Neill's interview had been censored. Secondly, I was outraged that licence fee money had been paid over with such haste and in circumstances where many barristers had argued convincingly that RTE could have successfully defended any threatened legal action. And thirdly, I was deeply concerned about the precedent that RTE's response could set for future public debate, not just on issues around equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual or transgender people, but also on a whole wide range of issues of public importance. And I felt very strongly that it was incumbent on you, Minister, to make sure that this decision does not set a dangerous precedent for public speech in this country. Freedom of speech is absolutely essential to democracy. It's one of the key things that distinguishes us between oppressive states like Russia. And as a Democrat, I defend the rights of others to freely express their views on every issue, even if I find their comments offensive. Because I think that public debate should always be open and robust. I think people should hear all views and then be free to make up their own minds as to who they agree with. I have no doubt that the two individuals that were named on the Saturday night show were offended by the comments that were made about them. But both of these individuals are high-profile journalists who frequently write things that others find offensive. They jealously guard their own freedom of speech, and rightly so. Yet as soon as somebody criticises them and pointed out the impact that their comments and their influence and the power that they have in public debate has had on other people, they issue legal threats against the individual concerned and the state broadcaster. In my view, it was particularly inappropriate for journalists to take such a course of action. They were offered a right of reply by RTE and could have taken up the opportunity either to speak on the Saturday night show the following week or indeed to use their own newspaper columns to outline their views. Instead, they opted for censorship and ensured that RTE paid €85,000 worth of licence fee money from each and every person in this country to themselves and to people associated with their own institute. In agreeing to settle, RTE, in my view, betrayed its responsibility as a public service broadcaster to ensure that both sides of the debate are heard on issues of public importance. As I said earlier, several barristers have argued convincingly that RTE could have won any threatened legal action on the grounds of the honest opinion defence to defamation. The defence which is set out in the 2009 Act and which applies to statements of opinion referring to matters of public interest where the defendant can prove that the opinion was honestly held and where facts on the opinion on which the opinion is based are stated or otherwise widely known, and the facts on which they're based are true and true or covered by privilege. Once these criteria are met, the opinion can be expressed in very unpleasant terms. It's an opinion. And I strongly feel it was clear from the show that it was Roy O'Neill's honest opinion that the individuals he referred to on the Saturday night show were homophobic. Now, you or I, Minister, might disagree with that, other people in this room might disagree with that, but it was his honest opinion, and our laws defend the right of people to put forward their honest opinions. He made it clear on the show that the definition of the word homophobic that he was using included not just irrational fear and hatred of gay people, but also discrimination and prejudice based on sexual orientation. And while people might argue that the word phobia conjures up impressions of extreme behaviour, as has already been pointed out, the actual definition that is increasingly accepted covers a whole spectrum of behaviour. Again, as pointed out by Roy O'Neill on the show, from the subtle to the extreme. But even taking the most restrictive interpretation of the word, I don't see how anyone could argue that the following comment given by John Waters in a newspaper interview is not homophobic. Mr. Waters said, and I quote, "This is really a kind of satire on marriage, which is being conducted by the gay lobby. It is not that they want to get married, they want to destroy the institution of marriage because they're envious of it." Minister, how anybody could argue that that view is not based on irrational fear is beyond me. And I think it was right that it was called out as such. I think that everybody has a responsibility in public debate to conduct themselves in a responsible way. But that can't mean that people are prohibited from giving their honest opinions on the hurt that they feel about arguments that other people have made in the public debate. So it is my view that RT's response was inappropriate. But that said, I think it's time to move on from arguing over the meaning of the word homophobia and focus instead on the discrimination that LGBT people still face in this country. And Minister, despite all the progress that has been made over the last few years, many lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people still face intimidation and discrimination on a daily basis. Homophobic bullying is rife in our schools. We still have laws in our books, as was mentioned earlier, that allow teachers and doctors to be fired just because they're gay, no matter how great a job they're doing. And loving couples are still denied one of the most basic and important rights of all, the right to marry. I think it's important that we have a free discussion about these issues, that we're free to challenge these issues, that we're free to point out the hurt that they cause. But I also accept that the country is engaged in a journey in terms of improvement and in terms of reaching full equality. I hope that embracing full marriage equality will be the completion of that journey. I personally, and I know Senator Bacik has made the same point, I don't believe that everybody who opposes marriage equality is homophobic. I've never said that, and I don't believe that. I think there are a lot of Irish people who just haven't engaged with the issue. Maybe they don't know lesbian and gay couples that are affected by it, that live on their street, that are in their families, so they don't understand the impact that it has. But I have seen firsthand at the Constitutional Convention how when people actually listen to those arguments, when they actually see the face of discrimination, when they listen to the personal stories, how it does change their opinions. So I think we're engaged in a journey of education and persuasion. And I think we need to listen to the very real concerns that people have, their fears, why they don't support equality, and we need to persuade them. And I think that should be the focus of the debate, is actually discussing issues. I just want to wrap up very briefly, because there was a little bit of latitude given. Can I just wrap up?
Senator, there's somebody not going to get in at the finish.
Okay.
That's what's happened. I have to call Senator now. That Senator has indicated, and I have to call the Minister at 6:45.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I could talk for
Senator Nolan.
I'd like to commend Senator Zappone and her independent colleagues, those present, for tabling this motion, and to welcome those guests in the gallery, and to also commend Senator Power. I was here when she raised the matter on the order of business the week following it, and it's an issue which she raises with great passion on a regular basis in the House. I'm delighted we're having the debate. Some will say it's current, timely, and topical, but I believe it's both overdue, really, and essential. And it's vital to have a debate on the issues of free speech, homophobia, and the public service role of the state broadcaster in these debates. Indeed, while these debates are all interconnected, free speech in modern Ireland, homophobia in modern Ireland, and the public service role of the state broadcaster in modern Ireland are all also worthy of their own parallel debates. I use the term modern Ireland when referring to these three debates, yet in the last few weeks I feel as though I've have time travelled from modern Ireland to Catholic dogmatic Ireland, and then back to modern Ireland again with a jolt. This time 3 months ago I thought we were in a modern Ireland, cosmopolitan, friendly and outward looking. A city for young people to come to, a city by and large without prejudice, a city which was friendly to all, no matter your skin colour, sexual orientation or background. Then a sequence of events happened, which other senators have alluded to, which I'm still struggling to reconcile. A sequence of events which made me wonder if we were really in a modern accepting country, or is it simply a face that we put on. A speech was made about homophobia, a can of worms as such was opened, and a stunning back and forth took place, with the state broadcaster apparently, or well, definitely, paying over taxpayers' money to the tune of €85,000. However, what happened since then has been heartening to me. We have seen people of all faiths and all backgrounds right across the country stand up and speak out in favour of equality. We've heard stories about homophobia right across the country. We have seen how the prejudices of some have gone unchecked for far too long, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to be exposed. During the weekend, for example, somebody who I won't name went onto a sports programme on an Irish radio station and said, when referring to gay people, and I quote, "What are their interests? I mean, if you've ever sat down with one, homosexual people, and asked them what their interests are, very often they have no interest in any kind of sport. That's my experience from sitting down with them. I've done it on a regular basis." Is this homophobic? Or is it misinformed? Or is it plain ignorance? Many wouldn't be entirely sure, but I know this much. It's exactly the kind of thing that shouldn't go unchecked. It's precisely the sort of language that needs to be called out for what it is: discriminatory, biased nonsense. We have a referendum coming up, probably in about a year's time. In a sense, this is probably the start of what will be a long-ranging debate on marriage, society, homosexuality, and a great many other things. However, this debate is a very useful exercise now at this juncture, insofar as defining the parameters of the debate, ensuring that the debate, which we witnessed with RTE and a journalist being paid by RTE, doesn't happen again, and making sure that this debate is conducted in a reasoned, civilised and decent manner. I was looking through the archives recently and discovered a quote from Senator Norris in 2003, where he said that the level of homophobia is appalling and it should be addressed in our schools and elsewhere. It's sad to think that now, more than a decade later, we still face an appalling level of homophobia in our society, and while things evolve and change, they perhaps do so just a little too slowly at times. I would like to commend the great work being done by LGBT charity Shout Out, who just formed last year, have visited over 45 schools right across the country, delivering anti-bullying workshops, and doing so on a voluntary basis, funded through internet donations. When it comes to the state broadcaster, They're working on tighter budgets than ever before, yet ensuring more output, to be fair. In short, like many other public sector groups, or institutions, they are doing more with less. And it should be commended for doing so. However, when it came to the potential threat of legal action against them, they seem to have, in my opinion, reached for the panic button and decided that a smaller payout on the taxpayer tab today was better than the risk of a larger payout further down the line. And perhaps they were right. And I certainly know, as a practicing litigation lawyer, that defamation cases are extremely expensive, and often these matters are decided on an economic basis. Thank you, Catherine. I'm looking forward to the referendum and to a real national debate of substance on this issue, but it's also a worthwhile exercise for RTE to establish the sequence of events which led them towards such a payout. I commend once again Senator Zappone and her independent senator colleagues in their group for giving us the opportunity to debate, and I look forward to the Minister's comments and responses, especially on the RTE issue. Thank you.
Horace?
Thank you very much, Ciara. I would like to commend my colleagues, particularly Dr. Zappone, and say how thrilled I am to see her partner and spouse, Anne-Louise Gilligan, here, restored to health with us in the gallery. That, to my mind, is the cream on the pudding. I welcome the Minister, mild, lukewarm, because I think he's been fairly limp in dealing with the press. I'm not one to hand out bouquets. I hope, Minister, you read the stuff I showed you, that I sent to you.
I was getting very worried about how polite you all are.
Oh, not so. Don't expect politeness from me, because I tell the truth, even to my friends, and even when it stings. Because I tell you this, the media have got to be taken on in this country, and you know that. But politicians here are gutless in the extreme. And let me just deal with this business of honest defence. And a petition that's been going round from the gutter press, supposed to go to the Taoiseach, saying, let's have the American system here. Let's not have the American system here. It is highly, highly dangerous. The business of honest opinion is quite dangerous too. It needs to be looked at very, very carefully. And you don't need to rely on it, because what those people have said consistently and done, and I have put it on the record of the House, I've said it on RTE, if they want to sue me, I'd be delighted, is plainly homophobic. And I can say something about that because I brought over Dr. John Spiegel when we were suing the Irish state, and he was the man who was head of the American Psychiatric Association when they changed the classification and decided that homosexuality was not illness. There was a discussion, and the word homophobia emerged from that, and it meant an irrational fear of gay people. Now, I have to say, with regard to the piece of bimbo beefcake that was on the radio the other day, playing rugby or whatever it was, and he said, I laughed like a drain. I mean, I know people have got to be protected against this because not everybody can laugh. But my God, I wouldn't like to be him the next time he goes into a barber. Because he said he never knew there were any heterosexual barbers. Well, that fella's going in for a crew cut if ever I heard one. And can I commend and congratulate the vision of Fiach McAneill, our just member here in the House, in having Panty on the stage of the Abbey Theatre. That was one of the great moments of theatre in this country since the time of W.B. Yeats. And thank you, Senator McAneill, for doing it. Now, I'm delighted that this has been an all-party thing. It was proposed by Senator Zappone, it was seconded by Senator Bacik of the Labour Party. I don't believe there's going to be a division on this. And it is absolutely wonderful that we are united in this way, as we should be. And I'd like to also pay special tribute to Avril Power. I was unwell at the time, but my goodness, we had a champion there. It was just absolutely fantastic. All kinds of people have joined in. Noel Whelan, a barrister, who gave his opinion in print in the Irish Times before he'd seen the programme. I mean, I wonder if you've ever heard of hearsay evidence, the poor thing. Anyway, God bless him. But then Archbishop Martin made up for it, because we all know that expression, if you want to know if the boot pinches, don't ask the boot, ask the foot. And Archbishop Martin said, it is the person who is offended who defines what being offended is. Bravo, Archbishop Martin. You're 100% right in that, as far as I'm concerned. And it was a good and a brave thing to do, in my opinion. Then there's the question of RTE. And Minister, you have a role here. And I've tried to get this taken up by both the Committee on Broadcasting and the Oversight Committee. It's an absolute disgrace. I'm quite a litigious person. You will never get an opinion from senior counsel that does not say there is always a risk. I want to see that opinion. And Minister, you must demand that opinion from RTE, because I know bloody well that it did not say what the Director General or whatever he was of RTE said, television said at the beginning. They were equivocal, they kept changing it, they were told of course at the beginning there might be a risk, but they were certainly, in my opinion, told it was eminently defensible. Eminently defensible. And no barrister worth his or her salt would have said anything else. And by giving in so gutlessly to the bullies, they let down free speech. I don't want to pay my television license after that. I despise them for what they did. And let's see, who are their opponents? Well, one of the journalists has been referred to.
Senator, you have 1 minute left.
Right, fine. 1 minute will be plenty for me to deal with the Iona Institute. How are they an institute? What constitutes? They've never done any original research. That's one of the qualifications for an institute. In Britain, they wouldn't be allowed to call them an institute. They're a self-appointed bunch of boot boys and boot girls who try to bully all the time. They're far nothing. They're run by a company called Lonic, if you don't mind. And Lonic's aims include advancing the Christian religion. Well, I'm a Christian. They haven't advanced me very much. They're not in favour of anything positive. They're against divorce, abortion, abortion information, same-sex marriage, liberal sex education, IVF, stem cell research, embryo research, euthanasia, and neutral education. That's what they are. And I have to say, there's homophobia around this place too. One of my colleagues who sits just here, and I spare his blushes because he's not here today, I heard on RTE radio saying that gay people wanted children as a fashion accessory. What's that if not? And there are 1 or 2 people here who put their names to amendments, which would have made me
Senator,
an outlaw in my own country if I went into a confectioner's shop to buy a wedding cake or ordered it. This is one of the most disgusting things, and it has to be rooted out wherever it happens, whether it's in this House or it's in RTE. And I would appeal to the Minister to take very strong measures about this matter and make sure that RTE does not let us down and that we get the money back. Can I end on this? I say to the Iona Institute, if there's any Christianity, any standard, any things, give the money back.
Senator, please. Senator O'Donnell.
Thank you, Catherine and Minister. I would never, ever, ever, ever stand up when a great speaker is speaking like we've just heard. Can I just say that when I first acknowledged Dr. Anne-Louise Gilligan in the public gallery, because I know her to be an outstanding, first of all, I know she's a marital partner of Senator Zappone, and also an outstanding speaker, teacher, philosopher, lecturer. I've known him for years, and it's an absolute privilege to have you in the public gallery. Firstly. The second thing I'd like to say, as an independent senator, I did not table this motion. The motion calls for a public debate on the issues of free speech, homophobia, and the public service role of the state broadcaster in such debates. Well, free speech and homophobia in the same sentence is as though one is an extension of the other, or without one, you cannot have the other. It is my opinion, senators, that there's no such thing as free speech. All speech is connected or rooted or intertwined and in and through our culture, our mores, our perceptions, our histories, our words, what is said, how it is said, who is saying it, and who is being spoken to. The Eskimos, the Inuit Eskimos, have 240 words, explanations for the color white, because they live in a white world. Language is always community. It's community where we agree on the rules, because my private language is my private madness. And the idea of free speech doesn't really exist because there are limits to free speech, if you think of inciting riot, and we cannot pretend that they're not. I think it was C.S. Lewis, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, no more, no less. The question is whether you can make words mean different things.
Humpty Dumpty.
Humpty Dumpty. And he says the question is, which is to be master? That's all. Now, a senior banker who in his official capacity as Chief of Bank of Ireland, which is the only roulette-tabled banker left standing in Ireland since the crash, said in front of the Taoiseach and a huge audience on Wednesday, February the 12th, at an IBEC Chief Executive Conference in Dublin, when speaking about his bank and the bank Celtic Tiger banking Las Vegas behaviour, one which he was in sole charge, he said, at a wild party, even good girls can get into trouble. Now, what about that for free speech? Where do we go from there in relation to free speech? I don't know where to start or end with the perceptions, the language, the mores, the words, the culture, and behind all that profanity and illiteracy. But we want a country in which he can say it, in which he has the freedom to say it, because he will certainly by me be destroyed by his own speech, his own prejudice, his own lack of thought, his own beauty, his own grace. He will be destroyed. But my answer would be to take my money out of his bank, but he will destroy himself in the process. In the same way, you cannot say that because I don't agree with marriage of same-sex couples, I am homophobic. I am entitled to say that, or believe that, or feel that. It is beyond reason or a reasoned argument to suggest that I am homophobic, because I do. I'm not fond of marriage, senators. I'm very fond of civil partnership and tenancy in common. I would not recommend to anybody single parenthood. I am a single parent, but it does not make me prejudiced against it. The motion also calls on the Minister of Communications to debate these issues and to outline steps that he and the government will take to ensure that the debate on marriage equality is conducted in a fair, open and impartial manner. Are we not doing just that? Is that not what the Senate is supposed to be about? Do I not sit here on a daily basis and listen to opinions and thoughts and feelings that I consider are from Middle Earth? Or indeed from stratospheres that are miles away from how I feel or how I'd like things to be? But they are fair, they are open, they can never be impartial. Disagree with Senator Zappone there, because especially it's very difficult to be impartial when there are agendas around. If there was an argument about impartiality, I would suggest that many of us, including myself, would leave most of our agendas in the attic and we might get further. I feel this part of the motion is benign and a functionalist request, because it suggests that an elected minister would do otherwise and get away with it. He would not, and he could not.
Senator Naughton.
Thank you, Catherine. I'd like to thank the Minister for joining us for this very important discussion this evening. Recent events in RTE, for whom the Minister has line responsibility, have brought this topic to the forefront, and I welcome that. I heard a certain newspaper columnist last week bemoan the fact that her own paper was the first to interview her since the Pantygate episode. She made the case that she was being refused a voice and all dissent was being crushed. Absolutely astounding from someone who has a weekly column in a national broadsheet. Indeed, her two fellow protagonists have a weekly column in national papers and are frequently on the national airwaves. The fact is that those particularly conservative views that were imposed on our society for decades are now being challenged openly. It does not amount to persecution, it amounts to valid criticism. I would urge both sides of this debate to conduct themselves in an orderly fashion and not to lose the goodwill of the citizens and the voters of the middle ground. Most amazing of all in this episode was the other Conservative protagonist in the Pantygate controversy, who also has a weekly column in a national broadsheet and is frequently on the airwaves. This gentleman gave an interview to the UCD student newspaper in 2012, which was reproduced with audio and a transcript on broadsheet.ie, and Senator Power has alluded to as part of that interview. I would urge all senators to read and listen to it. Is it right that the national broadcaster, who we depend on to get balance in public discourse, is forced to pay out to Conservative columnists who invited debate on this issue through their columns? RTE must have a robust attitude to debate, and if the legislation needs to be strengthened, Minister, I would urge you to look at it. I would ask the Minister if he is aware if RTE even did the most basic research before paying out this considerable sum of taxpayers' money. I would close my remarks by quoting a speech that some of our more conservative commentators should listen to. We sometimes have to listen, much to our regret, to voices of persons who, though burning with zeal, are not endowed with too much sense of discretion or measure. In these modern times, they can see nothing but prevarication and ruin, that our era, in comparison with past eras, is getting worse. They behave as though at the time of former councils, everything was a full triumph for the Christian idea and life and for proper religious liberty. We feel we must disagree with those prophets of gloom who are always forecasting disaster as though the end of the world was at hand. That, colleagues, was soon to be Pope St. John the 23rd. Thank you.
Senator Murrico.
First of all, I'm delighted the debate is here, and I welcome the Minister here this evening as well. And it's good to see so many senators here debating this particular amendment. I must say we have an enviable record in this House for respect for free speech. And I think we'll all admit that. And secondly, I think we should feel very proud that we have staunch advocates in this House for diverse causes and issues, and long may that continue. And I think it's one of the biggest arguments in favour of retaining Seanad Éireann. I think the question of free speech, which seems to be so substantial, but not necessarily the substantive issue in the motion itself, I don't think any Democrat can argue against free speech. I believe it's one of the strongest planks in democracy, and I think we should guard it jealously, and we've always guarded it jealously. And another plank in that democracy is the right to vindicate one's good name. And I hope that will also continue. And the challenge we have as Democrats is to find a balance between those 2 points. I believe, in fact, that the motion could have been enhanced greatly if both those planks were brought into the motion itself. But unfortunately, the question of vindicating one's name is absent from the motion. And I think in a way that takes from the debate and dilutes the potential for working together on any given issue, and particularly on the forthcoming referendum as well. We're focusing on a single issue here, which arises from the controversy coming out of the Saturday night show. But that's not the only time that RTE has given apologies. So if we're looking for change, let's see how does it impact on people. For instance, we had a senior trade unionist who looked for an apology because he was mentioned by a caller to the Joe Duffy show, and he got the apology. In the last 2 weeks on the Vincent Browne show, an independent deputy got a vindication of her name by way of a statement on the Vincent Browne programme. We've had the case of Father Reynolds. Now, they all fall into different categories. The case of Father Reynolds, certainly most people would agree that that was not right in itself. So in debating this, we need to look at the broader debate, particularly if we're asking for a change in legislation. Now, interestingly enough, and most of you, I'm sure, have been following this in the media, but I discovered when the initial frenzy related to the controversy tended to abate somewhat, that several journalists came out and put down markers as to why we should have caution in regard to the manner in which this was going. Martina Devlin, Eilish O'Hanlon, Emer O'Kelly, Pat Leahy, you look at their columns, and they've all raised very significant questions once that frenzy is raging. And there are only some. There are many, many more as well. I've heard people here asking during the abortion debate and other debates, and rightly so, I've heard people here argue, let's be calm. If we have a point of view, put the point of view. If somebody else disagrees with that point of view, isn't that what debate is all about? But I do believe this debate has gone off the rails. And I feel a terrible hurt for the people who have spoken here, Katherine and David, now I say this genuinely, I feel an awful hurt that they feel the hurt, and it's evident that they feel the hurt, and so many other people out there. And that debate can take place in a much quieter way. And the substantive issue here is precisely what you're seeking in the referendum and a change in the Constitution. But what has become the substantive issue is a word and the meaning of that word. And so much more has been lost in the course of that debate. We're here as senators. We enjoy huge privilege here in this House. And apart from directing some suggestions towards the Minister, we're largely speaking to ourselves. There'll be very few people stand up here and even make the type of points that I'm making, because most of the points will come from those who have supported the motion as it is. And could I say finally, I was fiercely impressed this morning by Senator Norris when he was able to break loose from a single issue and talk about the manner how certain sections of the media are endeavouring to manipulate this issue in order to get for themselves a carte blanche to say what they want to say. Senator Norris himself found it necessary to take out writs against various media outlets because of what was said, and people would put it in inverted commas, because of a robust presidential election campaign. Was he not right to go and do what he thought was right to vindicate his name? And that's why I'm so sad that the vindication of one's good name, which to me is so important, and we as Democrats should be arguing for it, is missing from the motion, and therefore there's lack of balance in that motion.
Senator Van Tornhout.
Thank you very much. I too, Minister, would like to welcome you to the House, and I'd also like to thank my colleague Senator Zappone for taking the initiative of this debate. Instead of focusing on a single definition of homophobia, we need to acknowledge that homophobia presents itself in a wide spectrum, ranging from violent hate crimes to far more subtle forms of discrimination. I too would like to commend Panty's address at the Abbey Theatre on the 1st of February and my colleague Senator Fiach McNeill for using our National Theatre in the way that it was so rightly used for a noble call. She articulated so succinctly the impact of subtle discrimination and homophobia on a person's psychic and mental well-being, causing them, in her words, to check themselves at the pedestrian crossing. I think the number of views and numbers of languages that video has gone around the world actually shows the power that words can have. It's really important that we don't have debates, though, about important social issues in isolation to each other. Social issues are invariably interrelated. Homophobia, self-harm, suicidal ideation, suicide. Tomorrow we'll have a debate on mental health and well-being. I think this is particularly true for young people, and in this context, LGBT youth. A report in 2008 was published jointly by Belong to Glen and the HSE called Supporting LGBT Lives. And that report found that 50% of LGBT youth have thought about suicide. 20% attempted suicide. LGBT young people are 7 times more likely than their heterosexual counterparts to experience mental health distress. It has also been established that young people identify their sexuality at age 12 on average, and the average age of coming out is 17. This 5-year period in which young LGBT people come to terms with their sexuality is vital. Living in a society where anti-gay bias exists can lead to many difficulties in this critical adolescent period. All this demonstrates the extent to which homophobia presents in society and impacts on the individual. The survey found that 80% of LGBT people have been verbally abused because of their identity. This is simply unacceptable.
LGBT people must be treated as equal citizens, and we must actively work to eradicate homophobia or discrimination, or any type of discrimination from our society. We live, I think, in a society that's obsessed by labels. We need to celebrate difference, and this can only be done through robust, open, and constructive debate. I was involved in a campaign a few years ago where the slogan was, "We need to keep labels for jars, not people." I, like many of my colleagues, am concerned by the speed and indeed indecent haste with which RTE responded to Rory O'Neill's comments on the Saturday night show. The decision to issue compensation, an apology, and indeed a right to reply to some of those perceived to have been injured may well have been disproportionate in the absence of a legal finding of harm done, especially given the compensation was made out of taxpayers' money. I'm also uncomfortable about the absence of commentary around the fact that the presenter of the show in question prompted Rory O'Neill to identify individuals by name. I think RTE's decision is worrying on a number of levels. I feel it has negative implications for freedom of expression and also the manner in which debates around marriage equality will be conducted in the future. We all need to accept that robust and sometimes volatile discussion will take place around sensitive issues, and we should embrace this and not censor it. It is evident in the aftermath of the Commons debacle that people were tripping over themselves on panels, trying not to say the wrong thing. And actually that doesn't bode well for healthy debate and open debate. The upcoming referendum on marriage equality will see many ensure that freedom of expression remains intact at all times. We need to send a message to young people that discrimination will not be tolerated. Homophobia does exist. There are real consequences on the targets of this abuse, and it's of the uttermost importance that our national broadcaster ensures open and fair debate, where both sides can communicate an argument in a fair and sensible manner. Thank you.
Senator O'Flaherty.
The Harligus Boilem, Tass and Vernon Chasson Chagas Takulish and Rune, Tass or Gore and Chalacht, Agus Fods could riven Hubble LGBT Tyner Mask and Chagas Nahana the Ederson. Bram Shenarida come on and Zisbro Shala Kursi Kinchruchta, Shachas Tir on Guinea Top Late. Minister, you're very welcome, and I'm glad we're having this debate, and I'm here in support of the motion. The politics of this debate centre on the censorship of certain views. Rory O'Neill's interview on the Saturday night show was taken off the RTE website, and compensation was quickly paid out to certain individuals who themselves aren't too shy when it comes to expressing their own opinions. This, Sinn Féin believe, is censorship of Rory O'Neill and a denial of his right as a gay person to name homophobia. We also question the speed at which RTE paid out compensation to those individuals and the legal advice which they received before doing so. RTE receives significant public funding, and as a result it is a matter of public interest that the legal advice, as has been stated previously, that it received should be published in full, and we'd call for that. The payout from RTE has huge implications for the way in which debate is conducted on social issues on our airwaves, with small, unrepresentative groups having the potential to set the parameters of what is acceptable debate. This case is unusual in that it has received far more attention than any other defamation claim levelled at RTE, and as such the public have a right to see the advice that RTE acted on. So I'm now calling on you, Minister, to ensure that RTE do publish that legal advice that they received. This, we also believe, doesn't set a good precedent for the upcoming referendum on marriage equality. There is a fear that if Rory O'Neill was censored by RTE for speaking out about homophobia, then this could also happen to other members of the LGBT community in the course of the debate. It is the LGBT community, as has been stated, who must define what homophobia is, and we do welcome the statements by Jim Martin in this regard as well. It is the LGBT community who are at the receiving end, and unfortunately know its demeaning and discriminatory characteristics best. There's also the politics of censorship surrounding this debate. This isn't just about homophobia and gay marriage. It's about freedom of speech and the obligation of the state broadcasters to facilitate this. From the early 1970s until the early 1990s, Republicans were banned from Irish airwaves and from Irish television screens. This ensured that important voices could not be heard and that a state-centred view of the Troubles prevailed unopposed. It would not be right for RTE as the state broadcaster to censor this or any other debate that concerns issues to do with human rights and the equal standing of minority groups before the law. As the state broadcaster, RTE must ensure the LGBT community receive adequate airtime in the run-up to the referendum on marriage equality. And I do think we're focusing on RTE in this debate, but we do need to remember that we have other broadcasters in the state. We have TG4, and there are also lots of radio stations who are subject to legislation. We need to remember them in this regard as well. A number of questions that I'd like to put to you, Ministers. Why did RTE not contest the allegations made to it by John Waters, etc.? And why did you, Minister, not intervene? After all, if you are either for freedom of speech or you are against it, there can be no half measures in this regard. As the Minister with responsibility for the national broadcaster, I believe you failed to defend this basic premise for the people of Ireland in not doing so. In relation to TG4, tá bródar in the Nairida, go duggan siad léargus eile an Síl in Éireann, and that they've branded themselves as the Súl eile. They also have a remit in this area, and in an Ireland of diverse communities, TG4 have experience in broadcasting content that is outside of the mainstream. It would be unfortunate if RTE had the monopoly of public service broadcasting on this issue, and it's important that funding to TG4 is secured and that they also are held to the same rigour of the equality legislation that we have. I was very proud that at our recent Ardèche in Wexford we launched a paper on LGBT rights in Ireland, and Chris Curran, my colleague and comrade, spoke very strongly on these issues. And he highlighted that successive Irish governments have failed to have the moral courage to stand up for what was right in relation to LGBT rights. And we must never forget that the Irish government was shamed into the decriminalisation of homosexuality by the European Court on Human Rights. The prolonged effect of this state-led discrimination has not only left a legacy of inequality, mental health issues and discrimination, it leaves overt and subtle homo and transphobia unhindered to undermine and demean LGBT people. This isn't just an Irish phenomenon. The regressive legislation adopted in Russia and Uganda sends a message around the world that gay people are something other than normal. In an Irish context, we have a state broadcaster unable to cope when challenged with subtle homophobia being brought to the surface. In fact, when our own LGBT Gardaí are prevented from marching a gay pride in their uniforms, while their European colleagues look on in amazement, surely this is evidence of a more pressing need, not just for legislative change, but a change in societal attitudes towards LGBT people. The Irish government has the power to make this change, and it should not be found wanting. They can admit to their role in the higher than average rates of suicide, mental health and self-harm endured by LGBT people. They can take and acknowledge the thousands of those who lost their lives due to their reluctance to legislate. Sinn Féin supports LGBT equality and calls on the government to eliminate legalised homophobic and transphobic discrimination against LGBT education and healthcare workers in the 26 counties, to amend the 1937 Constitution to include express equality protections for LGBT citizens and equal treatment for all family forms, set a date for constitutional referendum on same-sex marriage, include express equality protections for LGBT citizens and prohibitions on homophobic and transphobic discrimination in the forthcoming Bill of Rights for the North, and progress the Northern Sexual Orientation Strategy, including legislation to provide for same-sex civil marriage.
Senator McAneill. Senator Mooney.
Could I rise, as my colleagues on this side of the House have done, to support the entire concept of equality and inclusivity, and in the current debate I think Fianna Fáil policy is already well enunciated in that regard, and we look forward to an enlightened debate on the question of marriage equality. Could I, though, pick up on something that my colleague Senator Murku said in relation to what he believed was certain failings in the framing of the motion? I have to say, first of all, that I didn't see the Saturday night show, but I have read the fallout from what happened on that particular night, and I want to deal with that in a moment. But I think I should put on the record that the concepts of freedom of speech can be found in early human rights documents. England's Bill of Rights of 1689 granted freedom of speech in Parliament and is still in effect. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen, adopted during the French Revolution in 1789, specifically affirmed freedom of speech as an inalienable right. The Declaration provides for freedom of speech in Article 11, which says the free communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious of the rights of man.
Every citizen may accordingly speak, write and print with freedom, but shall be responsible for such abuses of this freedom as shall be defined by law. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, states, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers." However, I think everybody on all sides of the debate would admit that there is no absolute right to freedom of speech. There are restrictions. And I just want to put on record statements that were made by the solicitor for John Waters, Kevin Brophy, in the context of what has been said here and about the attacks on RTE and on those who received the payments. A statement by RTE earlier this week explaining why it paid out €85,000 in settlement of the Saturday Night Show panty controversy has been described as, quote, grossly misleading, unquote, by solicitor for John Waters, Kevin Brophy. Mr. Brophy continued, quote, they further went on to say that they took a particular course of action partly because of the decision by the complainants not to accept RTE's proposed remedies, unquote. This, Mr. Brophy said, quote, is a grossly misleading version of what actually happened, unquote. Outlining these events, he said that on the 11th of January, he was instructed by John Waters to write to RTE seeking an apology and a retraction and the removal of certain defamatory comments from the internet broadcast of the Saturday Night Show. My instructions were very clear at that time. John Waters and the Iona Institute clients wanted an apology and a retraction and nothing else. He said RTE had proposed a right of reply, which he says was like asking my clients to prove they are not homophobic, unquote. The statement says Waters also made several attempts to deal with the matter himself. Mr. Brophy said Waters then proposed the precise wording of an apology and further proposed that a donation of €15,000 be made to the Vincent de Paul to mark the seriousness of the defamatory comments. This proposal did not come from RTE. It came from John Waters. RTE were not happy to broadcast the apology we had drafted and instead said they intended to go ahead with a totally unsatisfactory two-sentence statement. Over the course of the following 7 days, an unsatisfactory wording was eventually agreed and was broadcast. RTE's response to the proposed donation to the Vincent de Paul was that they felt the figure should be 5,000. My very strong advice was for John Waters to issue proceedings against RTE, as I did not believe they were taking the matter seriously.
Still a member
it should also be noted that these negotiations were ongoing at a time. It should also be noted that these negotiations were ongoing at a time when John Waters was being subjected to the most outrageous level of online abuse and adversary commentary. Now, I put that on the record because it seems that there's only been one side of the argument here that seems to have been offended. But there's two sides to the story. And I have to say, as somebody who fully supports equality and inclusivity in society, and remember that although some would suggest on the record that they had been forced into it, it was a Fianna Fáil Minister for Justice that decriminalised homosexuality in this country. And my party,
Senator, you have 1 minute.
My party has a proud record in the context of inclusivity that I stand over proudly. So I'm under no illusions whatsoever about the difficulties that are faced by those who are gay and lesbian and transgender in our society. I have absolutely no illusions whatsoever about the hurt and abuse and vile abuse on occasions that's been hurled at them down through the decades. But at the same time, I would not like to have been accused of being homophobic and left it unanswered because I might have held a particular point of view which was interpreted as being homophobic. I would not like to have been accused of that. And I remember during the last European elections, in a debate on the Vincent Browne programme, where the party of which Fianna Fáil are aligned in Europe, ALDE, the Alliance of Liberal Democrats in Europe, it seems that they've taken, or some elements of it, took a particularly pro-abortion position. And I was accused, because I was somehow aligned through my party to ALDE, of being in favour of abortion, live on live television. How do you think I felt as somebody that's committed to pro-life, that is not in favour of abortion? That is not, to put on record, that is not in favour of abortion on demand.
Senator, I have to ask you to conclude.
How do you think I would have felt? So I understand how people who are who are gay, lesbian and transgender, how they feel when they're put in that position. But at the same time, I have to have some sympathy with people who are accused on live television of something that plainly they are not.
Yeah.
Senator Conway, you have 2 minutes, Senator.
That's no problem at all. Here, look, I suppose I'd like to finish up on a positive note, because I think the Minister is genuine in terms of his position when it comes to this issue. I think that we need to move on at this stage from what's happened, learn from the mistakes of what happened, and I think they've been well articulated. And I agree with my colleagues on all sides who were, I suppose, somewhat dismayed at the speed in which RTE coughed up. And there is a significant school of thought that felt it was the wrong decision, and I think that I'm inclined to agree with that. It wasn't appropriate at all. But I think that we need to move on to create a society that's not just equal, but that respects difference, that respects the fact that people have different orientations and treats them as equals. Because at the end of the day, we call ourselves a tolerant society. But when you see examples of what's happened in recent times, we clearly have a long way to go to become a tolerant society. So I think what the message that should go out from Seanad Éireann tonight is that we should aspire to the ideals of tolerance, the ideals of respect, the ideals of nipping this type of outrageous commentary that has happened, not just in recent times, but over time. I was particularly struck by our colleague Senator Norris's contribution on the Late Show recently, when he described in detail about how he was hit and attacked and jeered over the last couple of years. And everyone knows that Senator Norris is a third gentleman. And that type of behaviour is totally unacceptable. But thankfully, the Gardaí are on the side of decency now.
And I got 1,000 quid.
And the Gardaí will not entertain that. And the judiciary are on the side of decency. But what we need to do as a society at Cathaoirleach is engage at primary school level and have courses and educational awareness and so on at primary and secondary school level to ensure that future generations do not have to put up with what Senator Norris has had to put up with over the years in this so-called tolerant country.
And Tara?
Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach. Thank you to Senator Zappone and Senator Bacik and their colleagues for sponsoring this motion, and to each of the senators who contributed. I too am delighted to see Anne-Louise Gilligan in the public gallery, well on the road back to good health. I'm not so sure, having listened to Senator Norris, that I hold out the same prospects for the health of Neil Francis. Whatever about going for a haircut, he should certainly avoid a warm towel shave in the weeks immediately ahead. I'm also glad that Senator Mooney raised the question of this apology, because my understanding is that concession of the apology in the terms drafted would have been tantamount to destroying the honestly held opinion of Rory O'Neill. So there would have been very serious implications from accepting such an apology, and that's not in any way to impede Mr. Waters' desire to give money to the Vincent de Paul. Cathaoirleach, the controversy that has given rise to this debate has brought the issues of gay rights, homophobia, freedom of expression and the obligations of the public service broadcaster to the fore. Handling of and reactions to that broadcast have been subject to commentary, criticism and query, and I've spoken about the issue a number of times over the past few weeks. I said that personally I would not use the term homophobe to describe those who disagree with me on issues of gay equality in general, or gay marriage in particular. Perhaps that's the instinct of the politician, whose natural disposition is to persuade rather than confront. But what I've said, that I thought it was on the one hand too loaded a term, and on the other too imprecise in its meaning to be used to categorize all those who hold contrary views on a matter for legitimate public debate. Issues like this are informed by deep-felt religious, moral, and social considerations, but also, unfortunately, sometimes only by prejudice. Opinion will undoubtedly be divided. The best we can hope is that people debate the matter calmly, in good faith, and with respect for opposing viewpoints. I have also said that people who hold themselves out as commentators on or contributors to public debate must appreciate that debate can be robust, heated, personal, and sometimes even hostile. We politicians are expected to function as normal in such an environment, a norm that apparently does not apply to those fragile wallflowers who themselves are not restrained when dishing it out. Freedom of speech and of expression, and equally the right to be heard, are central tenets of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They are central to the proper functioning of civil society, and they cannot be taken for granted. Unless the media can report without fear or favour, then the public good is undermined. The right and ability of media to do this must be proactively asserted and maintained, and to quote the UN Secretary General, when it is safe to speak, the whole world benefits. As we all know, RTE is an independent public service broadcaster. It is obliged to be responsive to the interests and concerns of the whole community, to reflect the varied elements that make up the culture of the Irish people, and to uphold the democratic values enshrined in the Constitution, especially those relating to rightful liberty of expression. However, RTE will not be the lone platform for debate in the forthcoming referendum. We need to remember that information will be presented and opinions exchanged across all media. As the debate over the last few weeks indicates, media matters. As citizens, as voters, as representatives, we need a free, diverse media not beholden to a single sector of society, to large commercial concerns, or to a single political party. Whether we choose to admit it or not, for both politicians and those we serve, media play a central and critical role in conveying information, parsing outcomes, and passing judgment. They create the written and recorded account of what happens. In a very practical sense, they create the reality within which we exist and act. Because of this, the nature and character of media matters too. Its ability to speak truth to power and to challenge authority is one of those slender columns that sustains democracy. If that capacity is reduced in any way, then we are all the poorer for it. If media is fettered, either by the interests of owners, by fear of authority, or by the simple fact of groupthink, then our democracy is worse off. That proposition stands, irrespective of what any member of this House may think of the focus of sections of today's media. The development of a free and pluralistic media, both in terms of the technology and the legal and economic frameworks, has proceeded stepwise with the development of democracy. In simple terms, it's impossible to conceive of a modern democracy without a free and diverse press. The two are intrinsically linked. At EU level, both individual member states and the EU institutions have long had constructive involvement in media at a number of different levels. One of the instruments that remains available and which retains immense value is the fact that each member state can still support, due to the space made in EU law, its own national public service broadcaster. This is thanks in no small part to Protocol 29 of the EU treaties, which recognises that each member state's public service broadcaster aims to meet the democratic, social and cultural needs of the society in which it operates, and which also speaks of the need to preserve media pluralism. My conviction that public service broadcasting is a public good is not in the slightest undermined by the seeming inability of our own public service broadcaster to drag itself out of the rut of negativity that has so absorbed it since the economic crash. While I have not been silent on my views on homophobia and the use of homophobe as a label, I have sought to avoid intruding into or ascribing motivation to the RTE decision in respect of settling contemplated litigation. Senators will likely have read the recent statement from the Managing Director of RTE Television. The RTE explanation is that it had expert advice available to it that cautioned that it did not have a case to defend.
Totally incredible. Show us the advice.
Minister, without interruption.
As a result, it made the decision it made. It is true that RTE is the public service broadcaster, but it's also true that it is a commercial company and it made a commercial decision, as it does frequently in the face of contemplated defamatory actions. In his commentary of RTE's handling of the events, Mr. Killan stated that RTE had explored all possible legal redress mechanisms, including the possibility of a right to reply. The BAI's right of reply scheme provides for the broadcast of a right of reply statement that facilitates the correction of incorrect information which has been broadcast and which has resulted in a person's honour or reputation being impugned. It is an opportunity for a person to correct incorrect information without recourse to legal proceedings. All broadcasters are required to include on their website a copy of the scheme and contact information. Decisions by a broadcaster to refuse such requests can be reviewed by the BAI's Compliance Committee. However, a right of reply is about the correction of incorrect facts or information. The scheme does not provide for the broadcast of alternative or contrary opinions. In other words, a person may not be satisfied with the manner in which a broadcaster has relayed information about him or her, but a right of reply will not be granted unless the facts or information are factually incorrect. This was not therefore deemed an option for RTE on this occasion. Noteworthy, in his statement, Mr. Killan offered that RTE had not engaged in censorship, but was rather fallen foul of Ireland's defamation laws.
And that was complete rubbish and untrue.
It would be a matter of serious concern if recourse to our defamation laws was to have a chilling effect on public debate on the issue of marriage equality in the lead-in to the referendum. While the defamation laws are outside my remit, the Broadcasting Act is not. At present, Section 35 requires every broadcaster to ensure that nothing is broadcast that may reasonably be regarded as causing offence. I repeat my view that this seems to be an unfeasibly rigorous approach. We all know how easy it is for some people to be offended, even where offence was not intended and is not objectively ascertainable. I will shortly be proposing miscellaneous amendments to the Act. Among them, as I announced in the Dáil recently, I'm now considering an amendment that would require broadcasters to avoid causing undue offence. That seems to me to be a more objective and more in tune with the realities of public debate. And I'm not sure that I agree with Senator Zappone that the difference is minor, but we can talk about that when the legislation is published. If memory serves, in the case of the Press Council and Ombudsman for the print sector, the term they use is grave offence. I don't know whether that goes closer to meeting the objective here. In the specific context of referendum campaigns, Senators no doubt are aware that the Broadcasting Act of 2009 requires the BAI, as the independent regulator responsible for compliance in relation to broadcast content, to draw up broadcasting codes on the standards and practice to be observed by broadcasters. The BAI has accordingly published a broadcasting code on referenda and election coverage. This code sets out the rules with which broadcasters must comply when covering any election or referendum. The aim of the code is to ensure that broadcasters' coverage of elections and referendums is fair, objective and impartial. Coverage should be undertaken without any expression of a broadcaster's own views on an election or referendum or on parties or candidates. In covering the forthcoming referendum, broadcasters must ensure, for example, that coverage of the referendum is fair and equitable to all interests. The BAI has previously highlighted the need for broadcasters to put in place transparent mechanisms for ensuring that coverage in the run-up to the referendum and on the day that citizens cast their vote is fair, objective and impartial. It is incumbent upon the BAI and all broadcasters in the state to ensure that they adhere to the code on referenda and election coverage, as well as to the spirit and letter of the relevant judicial rulings in this area. I know that many people think the broadcasters' hands are tied by the Supreme Court decision in Coughlin and Broadcasting Complaints Commission given in 2000. The immediate effect of that decision was to get rid of party political broadcasts during referendums. Perhaps most of you will say no great loss. A knock-on effect, however, seems to have been the stopwatch phenomenon when it comes to measuring news and current affairs output in order to comply with a supposed 50-50 rule. Senators may recall Dr. Gavin Barrett of UCD writing back in 2009 that the application of the Coughlin ruling had the effect of politicians and parties in a referendum finding themselves given literally not 1 second more time on the airwaves than unelected campaigners whose sole qualification before being handed 50% of airtime on both public and private broadcast media is that they have uttered the word no. Put another way, he wrote, influence formerly enjoyed by elected politicians has been transferred directly to unelected pressure groups or politicians with a tiny proportion of national electoral support. The result of the application of this case law has been to play down or neutralise the role of political leaders in favour of committed amateurs.
Question again, Minister.
Well, that's certainly a thought, but I think that would and ought to come more probably from a citizen than from an office holder. It is argued that, taken together with the McKenna No. 2 judgment, this case ensures that the entity which arguably has the most democratic legitimacy claim to exercise persuasive force, i.e. the elected government, is largely prevented from doing so and effectively emasculated in its leadership role. But to deal with the Coughlin case specifically, that ruling was directed only at uncontested broadcasts, including party political broadcasts, since no complaint was made in relation to news and current affairs coverage. In practice, however, the effect of Coughlin seems to have been to create a situation in which broadcasters feel constrained to give 50% of airtime to both sides of a referendum campaign. If this has happened, it is not because of the BAI or its codes. The current edition makes it clear that, and I quote, there is no automatic requirement to allocate an absolute equality of airtime to opposing views during coverage of a referendum. However, the allocation of airtime must be equitable and fair to all interests and undertaken in a transparent manner. Broadcasters should note that allocation of airtime is not the only measure of fairness. It will be necessary for a broadcaster to consider the range of ways in which fairness is achieved and to ensure that active consideration is given to ensuring its achievement, whether through the selection of contributors, the scope of the debate, the structure of the programme, the makeup of audiences, the role of the presenter, or through other suitable means. Broadcasters should also note that a referendum debate is a dynamic discussion, and the approach taken to airtime and to coverage in general is likely to evolve over the duration of a campaign. Nonetheless, it seems that 50-50 is still the default provision. We all recollect how artificial it was to seek to allocate equal time on the airwaves to those arguing against the Good Friday Agreement, or the Children's Rights Amendment, or the establishment of a Court of Appeal. I would invite the BAI and the public service and commercial broadcasters, who are bound by its codes, to consider what further refinements can be made to the referendum code whilst respecting the strictures of the Supreme Court judgment. It may be that, so far as political parties are concerned, the 50-50 rule creates a perverse political incentive to oppose constitutional amendments, given the almost guaranteed access to the airwaves that will follow. However, when it comes to a small and unrepresentative interest group, I'm not sure that the same considerations would apply. If the same handful of individuals are seen and heard on every news and current affairs programme in the run-up to the vote, it may simply serve to demonstrate just how small and unrepresentative a group they really are. Finally, I wondered aloud in the Dáil last week whether in the medium and longer term, the terms of public discourse on such a fundamentally important issue as marriage equality, whether we will have been damaged by the recent controversy. As I stated then, it seems to me that this far out from the referendum, it may be no harm at all that these issues have been ventilated now. RTE has a crucial role in the conduct of public debate, and I believe it remains fully committed to ensuring the full and free exchange of information and opinion on all matters of legitimate public interest. I stand by my position that I draw a distinction between my intruding in the management of any particular litigation file and my insisting that RTE in no way resiles from the obligation on it to discharge its public service duties under the Broadcasting Act. And that's the critical factor as we prepare to put the building blocks in place for the ultimate referendum. And I don't really think that Senator O'Cloherty is seriously asking me to intervene. If I were to intervene in every litigation file in RTE or every editorial decision, Senator O'Cloherty and all those excellent young social science graduates from UCD writing scripts for the Sinn Féin party would be after my garters. So, you know, I don't think you're seriously arguing that I should intervene, because political intervention in that particular fashion would not add anything to the debate that we're talking. Ultimately, we rely on broadcasters to provide a forum for matters of public debate and indeed controversy, and to ensure that when these take place, the necessary level playing field is provided for all concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Is the motion agreed? Motion agreed.